Hiya everyone, I hope you're all safe and well. I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for all your support on all the other videos that I've done so far, and I'm getting a good little true crime playlist, so it's making me really happy. I'll be 100% honest, I wasn't going to do this case this week. I actually got halfway through researching another case and I went to double check that no one else had done it, and someone uploaded it really recently. So it might be one that I do go to in the future. But I obviously didn't want to just upload the same video like 2 days after, so this one has been on my list for a while, but I wasn't going to do it until a little bit down the line, but I thought I'd do it this week, so I really hope you like it. I always talk in my intros about cases being frustrating, but this one, a lot of the times it's frustrating that someone wasn't caught because either something wasn't reported or people weren't taken seriously, and this case has none of that. It's just frustrating because of the time it was set and the technology that they didn't have at that time, basically. So that's all I'm gonna say. But this guy slipped through the net so much, and you'll see what I mean. Today I'm going to be talking about a man called Angus Sinclair, and he was born in 1945 and he lived in Glasgow in Scotland. So he was the youngest of 3 siblings, but they didn't have much parental guidance after his dad died when he was young. He was described by neighbours as a bit of an outsider. He'd just stand against a wall and he would just watch all the kids in the street play, but he'd never actually join in himself. He just liked to observe people. In 1961, when Angus was just 16, he actually sexually assaulted an 8-year-old girl. And just 6 months later, he'd go on to commit his very first murder. Catherine Rehill, who actually lived really close to him, and she would go on messages for him in exchange for some money, and one day he asked her to go on a message for him, and when she came back, that's when he sexually assaulted her. As this was happening, someone actually knocked on the door of the apartment, and he just went to the door, acted dead normal, and kind of hurried them away a little bit and then carried on. Catherine was strangled and also died of blunt force trauma. Angus threw Catherine's body down the stairwell and tried to make it look like an accident, and he actually called the ambulance for her himself. Angus gave a false alibi to the police and he tried to make it out like he was trying to help with the investigation, but they soon came to realise that he was actually the only person who could have done this, but it really wasn't easy getting him to confess to the murder. Angus's older brother John actually had to get him to confess to it and help the police, and he eventually did confess to it. But John said he wasn't remorseful at all, and in interviews later in life, John had actually said he would rather have killed Angus than him go on to do what he did. He said he would have done time for killing his brother than have him go on to be a murderer. Because Angus was a minor, he was actually only given 10 years for Catherine's murder and only ended up serving 7. But also in those times, because he was a minor, it wasn't seen as a proper sentence. I'm not sure if it's different now, but there wasn't much of a record of it. The psychiatrist report at that time said he's obsessed with sex. I don't think any form of psychotherapy is likely to benefit his condition, and he will constitute a danger from now onwards. Given the minimum of opportunity, he will repeat these offences, irrespective of the promises he may give to the contrary. So Angus did 7 years in prison, and while he was in there, he actually learned about painting and decorating. So when he was released in 1967, he actually walked right into a job. Angus got married and he had a child. Everyone thought he was doing really well for himself. He'd done his time, he'd learned his lesson. You know, all that was from when he was younger, and really that was so far from the truth. In 1976, a 7-year-old girl was with her dad in the house, and they were actually robbed by 2 masked men, one with a knife and one with a hammer. They told them to lie face down and they tied their wrists and ankles together. They knew that the rent man was coming, so when he did come, they attacked him with a claw hammer, stole all his money and left with hundreds of pounds. This attack was actually said to happen during the lunch hour of Angus's job. But the wrong man was actually charged with this, and it was only years and years later, when the man who was with Angus, who committed the crime, confessed to it. They would never have known it was him if that hadn't happened. Because he got away with this, it made him a lot worse. On October the 15th in 1977 in Edinburgh, 4 friends were on a night out. They were all around 17, they were all going out to different pubs to see where they could get in, where they could get a drink. Everyone would just kind of meet up in the pubs, stay there until around 11 when they'd get kicked out, and then they'd see where they could go afterward. They ended up in the World's End pub, which is on Edinburgh Royal Mile, and it's kind of a touristy place, but it is where a lot of people used to meet up, but it is quite small. Two of those girls were Christine Eady and Helen Scott, and they were both 17. They were friends from school and they'd been best friends since they were kids. Helen was a bit younger than Christine and she was said to just be a country girl. She loved animals and children, and Christine was described to be the life and soul of the party. So over 200 people were in and out of the pub that night and everyone kind of knew each other. They recognised who was who. Helen and Christine's two friends went to go low, and when they did, two men that they'd never seen before came over and started speaking to them. And when their friends came back, they'd actually been asked to go to a nearby party, and they asked Helen and Christine if they wanted to go, but they had already started speaking to these guys and just said, "Oh no, we're okay, thank you. You go ahead, we'll stay here, we're okay." So they carried on speaking to the men until it was closing time for the pub. They're believed to have been seen by a policeman who was on duty at around 11 o'clock when the pub closed, and they were in the same kind of area as the two men who were walking behind them but a little bit back. So Helen and Christine were only 17, so their families were waiting for them to come back from town. Helen's dad actually got up, realised that she wasn't home, but went back to bed when the mum was already staying up. He didn't think much of it because sometimes Helen would stay in Christine's or Christine would stay in Helen's because they were quite close. It just sometimes ended up that way. So they didn't panic immediately, but it was out of character for them not to come home. So Helen's mum eventually went to bed, but in the morning they both hadn't returned home yet. So both families started calling round everywhere, and Helen's family actually drove to the flat of one of the other friends that was out, and then they went straight to Edinburgh Police Station to report Helen and Christine missing because no one had seen them since the night before. Unfortunately, when they returned home, they heard on the radio that a body had been found. Christine's body was found at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon by a couple who were walking along the coast. She was found naked and lying on her back with her tights and pants, gagging her and strangling her. There was no attempt at all to hide Christine's body, she was just left in the open. So the road near where Christine was left was actually on a bend, so you could see traffic coming from both sides quite a bit away, so you'd know to hide if you saw headlights coming, and if it was the night time, the night before, they would have been able to just stop what they were doing and act like nothing was going on. But if they were there on the bend, they could see that no one was coming, and they would have been able to assault Christine. Not long afterwards, there was another report that a second body had been found. Helen was found in a field about a mile or so up a country road, and she was found face down, naked except for wearing a coat. She'd also had her clothes used to strangle her and her arms tied behind her back. Helen's family straight away had to identify a coat to confirm that it was Helen's, which would confirm that the body was Helen as well. They knew straight away that the two murders were definitely linked. These two girls were friends, they'd been seen together. The murders were really, really similar. Unfortunately though, forensic science wasn't what it is today in the 70s. They would go a lot on things like blood, hairs and fibres. They didn't know what DNA was even then. All of the clothing, the ligatures, the swabs, they were all examined, but unfortunately the scientists didn't have the technology to be able to properly read it. So all of these things were stored and they were frozen and they were saved for if that technology was created in the future, they'd be able to come back to it. But for then, they just had to go off trying to find the people who may have been in the pub. So the police went to the pub and they tried to find out who it could have been who was there that night. They had a photo made of what witnesses said the man looked like. They ended up having thousands of leads, but unfortunately the leads just didn't go anywhere. They had more leads through the 80s and 90s, and every time they got one they'd properly look into it, but it just wasn't going anywhere again. But a few months before Helen and Christine's murders, there had been other murders happening. These murders, however, took place in Glasgow. A lady called Frances Barker, who was 37, had been found bound, gagged and strangled, and it said that Angus had lived in that exact same street. Anna Kenny was 20 and she was last seen trying to get a taxi outside the pub. She was found in a shallow grave 2 years later, but it's believed that she was killed in 1977 around the same time as the others, and it was close to where Angus had spent his honeymoon. A lady called Hilda Macaulay was 36. She had 2 sons who she loved so much, but every Saturday she liked to have a little bit of a break and go out dancing. She ended up in a place called the Plaza, which was close to where Angus was working at the time. She was found 2 weeks before Helen and Christine's murder, and she was found bound, gagged and stabbed. Agnes Cooney was 23. She was a trainee nurse and she was looking after her 5 younger siblings. She was last seen leaving a club in Glasgow and she was found in farmland. Again, she was found bound, gagged and stabbed, this time in the neck. Agnes was said to have really fought for her life and she had loads of wounds that showed that. It wasn't an easy kill with Agnes, and it's thought to be this that made Angus maybe look for a weaker target. There were so many similarities between all of these murders. There was a lot of focus on the neck. They were all found in either wasteland or farmland, and they were all sexually motivated too. During all these murders was when Angus actually had his own caravan between 1977 and 1980, and all the girls that were found seemed to have been abandoned from a vehicle kind of in the middle of nowhere. But unfortunately there wasn't any forensic evidence for any of these cases. In Glasgow in 1978, a girl called Mary Gallagher, who was 17, was found. She'd been snatched when she took a shortcut to meet a friend through some woods, and there was a small cut on her back as well that made it look as though she'd been threatened with a knife and it had been pressed up to her back so she'd walk further into the woods. This wooded area was by Barnhill Station, which is where her body was found. She'd been raped and her throat had been cut. So I mentioned before about Angus maybe looking into weaker targets, and unfortunately that's when he moved on to children. He started indecently assaulting and raping children between the ages of 6 and 14. This all happened between 1978 and 1982 and all in Glasgow. He used a similar tactic to what he did when he was 16. He'd usually ask the kids to either follow him or to go on a message for him, and then he would assault them. One of the little girls, Lynn, actually reported it, and she described the man to have flecks of paint in his hair, and she was able to point out Angus in a police lineup. Angus pleaded guilty to 3 rapes and 7 indecent assaults towards children, although he said later on that there could have actually been hundreds of victims. After examining Angus, psychiatrists said that he would be a permanent menace towards children. So in 1983, Angus was back in prison. He had a job in the kitchen and he was said to be a model prisoner. He was really well behaved in there. Because of this, it wasn't taken seriously that Angus might actually do something else if he was let out. 6 years later, Helen's mum unfortunately passed away and she never knew who killed her daughter. But Helen's dad promised the mum that he would continue to fight for justice and to find Helen's killer. In 1994, because Angus was apparently so well behaved, he was actually given day release to go to a boat festival. And at this festival, he was actually given permission to run a stall selling children's toys. He made these toys while he was in prison, and none of the people in charge actually realised that he was given permission to go there. They found out afterwards and they were actually really angry about it. Understandably, I don't know whose idea it was to let him go there, but none of the people in the festival knew who he was. It's not believed that he attacked anyone during that time, but he could have done, and it's just crazy. I don't know why that was ever allowed. In 1998, forensic science had started to slowly improve. And because Angus was now in prison and his DNA had been taken and put onto lots of records, a semen sample from Mary Gallagher's pubic hair was examined and it was found to be a complete match to Angus. So Angus was going to be sentenced for Mary's murder. When he was told, he was really shocked that this had been found and this had been dug up, and he completely denied it, but he was found guilty and he was given a life sentence for the murder of Mary Gallagher. In 2004, forensic science was again just getting better and better, and they were coming up with new ways to look at evidence. Because of Mary's case and all the cases surrounding it being so similar, including Helen and Christine's murders, they had a suspect now, which was Angus Sinclair. They were all being treated as connected and they were all being looked at. They just needed evidence that put Angus at the scene of those crimes. Luckily, a square of material from Helen's coat was actually saved and frozen for all those years, and they were able to use the new forensic science to look at it properly again. Helen's coat had DNA on it and they found 2 profiles. They knew the first one had been there, but the second one was so small that only this new technology was able to find it. So they knew one was Angus, they didn't know who the other one was. After looking for a while at who was associated with Angus at that time and who matched the description of the man that they put out years ago, they came down to Angus's brother-in-law. So Gordon Hamilton was Angus's wife's brother, Angus had said, I had consensual sex with both of these girls, which is why my DNA's on them, but the murder was Gordon and I didn't know anything about that. But Gordon had passed away in 1996 and he wasn't around to ask. They only had Angus's word for it that he was the other man. They had to try and find some of Gordon's DNA, but he'd been cremated, he had nothing left. But they came up with a genius way, in my opinion, of finding DNA. It's amazing. Gordon had actually done some work on a house 10 years earlier and they went to that house, took away what he'd done, and they took samples from where he would have held the thing he fixed to the wall, and they actually got his DNA from that. And when they tested it, it was a match, which made Angus and Gordon the ones that had been there on the night of Helen and Christine's murders. Because Angus and Gordon had been linked to these murders, Angus was the prime suspect for all the other murders in Glasgow. Unfortunately, someone had been arrested for Francis Barker's murder and had served 30 years in jail. Because Angus's DNA had been linked to these murders, it was time for him to go to court. He stuck to the story about him and Gordon having consensual sex with Helen and Christine, but Gordon was the one who killed them and he didn't know anything about that. He was sticking to this story and he said that's why the DNA was on Helen's jacket. It said that critical evidence wasn't put forward to the jury and unfortunately he was acquitted. So after 30 years of waiting for this man to be brought to justice, the families had to leave there and he hadn't been punished for these murders. The trial only lasted 2 weeks and after that he was returned to prison. There was a law at the time called the double jeopardy law, which means that if someone's acquitted, they can't be retrialed. If they've already come to a decision about a certain case, that's it, they can't be put on trial again. But the law was reviewed in 2011 and it was changed so that if there was new evidence, the person could go on trial again for the same murder or the same crime. So as I said, Angus's main story was that all of the sex was consensual, which is why his DNA was on Helen's jacket, but the murders were Gordon's fault. However, Angus's DNA was found on the ligatures that were tied around the girls' necks, which meant that it had to be Angus who tied the knots. On the 13th of October 2014, Angus was found guilty for the murders of Helen and Christine, and he was given 37 years in prison. The sentence matched the 37 years that the families had to wait for this man to be brought to justice. And if the law hadn't ever been looked at or changed, he would never have been found guilty of these murders. Angus actually wasn't charged with Anna, Hilda or Agnes's murders. Over the past 10 years, the advances in forensic science and DNA means that things like rapes and murders can be reinvestigated, which I think is just amazing. Last year on March the 11th, Angus Sinclair passed away in prison. He'd had a series of strokes and he died alone in his bed. He was found by staff in the morning and was believed to have passed away in the night. They don't 100% know that he was responsible for the murders in Glasgow, but the FBI looked at the cases and everything and they do believe that it was the same person. But as I said earlier, there's no DNA from those murders, it just wasn't around at that time. So there's no 100% definite it was him for those. Angus Sinclair's most well-known murder is the murder of Helen and Christine, which is sometimes known as the World's End murders. Although that was a massive case, I feel like if he was responsible for all of those other murders, then so many more women have passed away because of him. So I didn't want to focus just on the one. So that's the story. I hope you found it interesting. I definitely did. I don't know a whole lot about forensics or anything, but I would absolutely love to know more about it. I do find it so interesting when it's the slight clue. Like finding Gordon's DNA in a house he worked in 10 years ago. I just think it's amazing that they can find things like that. I am really happy that the law was changed because, as I said, he would have never been convicted of these horrible murders if he hadn't have been given a retrial. The families just would have waited 30 years for them to be like, oh, that's the man, he was there, he knows what happened, he probably did it, but we're not gonna do anything about it. That would just be absolutely heartbreaking, especially with Helen's poor mum passing away, never knowing who did it. But I am glad that the families finally got their answer, but I do wish that there was some way of going back and looking into the other murders to see if there was any way of pulling out DNA, if they have anything. Even though I know Angus is dead now, I think it would still be good for the other families to have that closure on who did it. Because even though they do think that it was him, it's not 100%, as I said. So I'm hoping to bring you more true crime videos soon. I really hope you liked this one and found it interesting. Please like and subscribe because it really helps me, and leave a comment below about what you thought about this case. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!